So welcome everyone to today's webinar, Sustainable Soil Management and Reuse. Today we're joined by IES member Andy O'D. Andy is Technical Director at Cognition Land and Water. He has almost 30 years experience as a Project Manager, Director, Geoenvironmental and Geotechnical Engineer in Sustainable Land Development and Infrastructure Projects. Today's webinar will look at sustainable management and reuse of soils on construction sites and challenges in the current regulatory climate, with a push away from tried and tested methods towards cumbersome and ill-suited procedures. As always, there'll be a chance for questions at the end of the presentation, so please submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I will submit these later on your behalf. Thank you for logging in today, and I'll now hand over to Andy.
That's great. Thank you very much, Derek. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your day to join me on this. Despite my camera looking very gloomy, it's actually a lovely sunny day here in Reading. So yeah, thank you for taking time to join me. As Derek said, I'm going to be talking about sustainable management and reuse of soils on construction sites. Some of you will know a fair bit about this subject, some of you maybe a little bit less, so a bit difficult for me to sort of pitch this at the right level, but hopefully there'll be something in it for everyone. And in the Q&A at the end, maybe we can cover some ground, some technical or more detailed queries if you have them. So what am I going to cover in the next half hour or so? I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. I think that's important, my background, and also a bit about Cognition, where we fit into this issue. The issue itself, why sustainable use of soils is so critical, so important. Some of the regulation options. How do we actually regulate, and how is the reuse of soils on construction sites regulated, and some of the challenges, some of the key challenges that we have in that respect at the moment in our industry. I'll cover a few project examples where we have had some really good successes in terms of sustainable reuse of soils on construction sites, land development projects in the main, but also infrastructure projects. And then where next? Where does the industry go to? Well, we're sort of facing a bit of an impasse really in the industry in terms of the regulation of the reuse of construction soils. So some suggestions as to where we might go next. So a little bit about me. As Derek said, I'm Andy O'D. I'm a technical director. I'm a civil engineer by background, and then moved into soil mechanics and environmental geotechnics, contaminated land. But I'm also a chartered environmentalist. I've been a member of the Institution of Environmental Sciences for, I think it's about 15, 20 years now at this stage. But also, as you see from those letters there on the screen, I'm also a QP for DAOCOP. Now, those I'll explain a little bit later on what DAOCOP is and what a QP is, which is a qualified person under that scheme, and why that's so important in terms of the topic. I have 30 years. More than 30 years experience, mainly in consultancy, but moved across to contracting 3.5 or so years ago. So I suppose I can give you a perspective from the design and consultancy side of things, as well as the contracting side of things. And almost all of my work over those 30 years has been on sustainable land development and infrastructure projects. I specialize in contaminated land risk assessment and remediation, waste management, soil gas risk, and geotechnical design. And a little bit about Cognition. As I said, I work for Cognition Land and Water. This isn't a sales pitch for us as a contractor, but I think it is important that you understand our background and where we come from, and why I suppose I'm giving this talk today, to raise awareness. We are a contamination remediation and ground engineering contractor. We've been around for about 20 years or so. We became carbon neutral as a company over 2 years ago now, which is we're very proud of that, and it's very important to us. And one of the biggest ways that we actually achieve that is in the work we do in terms of reuse of soils, minimizing disposal to landfill. We have about 50 or so technical and management staff, and about another 100 or so site staff. And we're of a broad range of skills and experiences within the company: engineers, chemists, geologists, environmentalists, and very importantly, several ex-regulators as well. Excuse me, people who've worked many years in the Environment Agency and local authority, and they give us that sort of perspective that we bring to our work. Typical projects range from about £500,000 to £30 million in size, and minimizing soil disposal and maximizing reuse on construction sites is, in my mind, is everything that we do. That's where we have the greatest impact by far in the work that we do, avoiding disposal of soils and filling up landfills unnecessarily. So what is the issue? Well, it is a huge issue in our industry. Waste construction soils are equivalent to five times domestic waste that's generated in the UK in an average year. 80% of construction waste is soil. Soil is a hugely valuable resource. We really don't want to be creating a waste from that material and disposing of it. 60 million tons of waste soil are generated each year in the UK. Sorry, I should say that these are government statistics from 2018, the most recent data available. And shockingly, only 12% of waste soil was what's officially called recovered in 2018. Personally, I think we should be ashamed of ourselves and embarrassed as an industry that this is what we're doing. Soils make up 58% of the waste that's received by landfills. And these sort of statistics are really terrible. We need to be doing a lot better, but hopefully you'll see later on in the presentation that there are lots of hurdles in the way of achieving better in terms of those numbers. Some would say that waste regulation is complex, time-consuming. Yes, it is. There's no doubt about that, but it's not insurmountable. It's not beyond the wit of man for us to get over this issue, the law and the regulations. Some say that contaminated soils can't be reused on sites. I disagree completely, and we've got lots and lots of examples where contaminated soils can be remediated, cleaned up, made suitable for use and reused on construction sites where they present no risk to the environment or future users. And some say that landfills are full of black bag waste that can't be safely processed or reused. Again, I have lots of experience. We have lots of experience on regenerating, remediating old landfill sites and bringing them back into beneficial use. And that is absolutely not the case. On most of those sites, 80 to 90% of the material that's in those landfills is soil that can be recovered, reused on sites. So let's do some debunking, as I've said. So what, I suppose, you may ask yourself, why is this important? Most of the projects that you and I maybe get involved in involve foundations, earthworks, excavations, generating soil. You may not know, but reusing that soil within a site may actually be a waste activity. If you don't control, manage, record that process, you may unwittingly be creating a waste and depositing a waste. And there are implications to that that I'll talk about in a bit. And all waste activities either require an environmental permit or an exemption from an environmental permit. So the result of this is that in the UK, thousands of waste management offences are unwittingly committed every year on UK construction sites, and millions of tonnes of soil are unnecessarily disposed of to landfill. I have lots of examples. Those of us in the contracting side of the business, of the industry, I can give you plenty of examples of where that's the case, where we really should be reusing those soils on site and not putting them in landfills. And the easiest way and the best way to avoid that is really to avoid it becoming defined as a waste in the first place. Again, I'll explain in a minute why that, how we can do that. First of all, though, I'm going to give a shameless plug for an upcoming guidance document from CIRIA. Some of you should be familiar with CIRIA, which is a construction industry research and information association. And I've been involved in this on the project steering group for this guidance document. Cognition have also funded it because we see it as being extremely important. And really, this is a way of promoting and simplifying opportunities to reuse surplus soils on site. The idea is that it's concise but comprehensive, up-to-date and interactive guidance that explains the whole process of soil management from cradle to grave. So keep an eye out for that. It'll be published within the next few months. So some of the regulation options, before we go into that, it's important that you understand what is a waste. And there is a legal definition of a waste. Lots of you will have heard of this before, I'm sure. And really discarded is the important word here. So a material is only considered a waste if it's discarded, if you intend to discard it, or if you're required to discard it. And that's enshrined in law. But once a material is discarded and it becomes a waste, it remains a waste until it's fully recovered. And there are only certain ways in which that material, that soil, can be recovered. It's important to know, therefore, that waste is not related to its chemical composition. A material can be contaminated, and it can be contaminated in certain situations, but it can still be suitable for use on a site if used in a particular way, or it can be remediated and treated to make it suitable for use. It's not necessarily a waste if it's contaminated. Or even if it has a value to you, if you're still discarding it, then it still could be a waste. So what should you do? Hopefully you'll all be familiar with the waste hierarchy. What we really need to be doing is staying as high as we possibly can in terms of the management of soils on construction sites in the waste hierarchy. So reducing the amount of waste that we generate. And if we can't reduce it, then we reuse it, recycle it, recover it, and so on. And the last option absolutely should be landfill. That's the least favorite option, sending soils to landfill. So I'm going to run through, sorry, just to go back, I'm going to run through that sequence, reduce, reuse, recycle, recover, and dispose in the following series of slides, and give you examples of how that process is regulated. The top one, and the one that I think is really the best tool that we have in the industry at the moment for reusing soils on site, and a tool that avoids a soil being defined or classified as a waste in the first place, is something called the DAWCOP. This is the Definition of Waste Industry Code of Practice. It was introduced in 2008, so it's been around for about 15 years or so. It has been revised. There's a new version that's imminent. It's been with the Environment Agency for quite a while. We're waiting with bated breath for that to come through, version 3. Originally, this document and this process was approved and supported by the Environment Agency, but I'm afraid to say that the Environment Agency, in some respects, seem to be having sort of cold feet in terms of the use of the guide. And things have changed recently in terms of the acceptability of using this DAWCOP process in certain situations, which is unfortunate, I think, because, as I said, I think it's the best tool we have. By applying the process in the DAWCOP, you can, soil does not become a waste on a construction site if it achieves these 4 key principles. The first one is that it needs to be protective of human health and the environment, and everyone would agree with that. That's fine. It needs to be suitable for use without further treatment. Again, that's fine. If the material is suitable, then it can be reused. It can be treated under, let's say, a mobile plant permit before it's reused. And those two in combination, the mobile plant permit and the DAWCOP, could allow for a material to be reused on the site. There also has to be certainty of use. It can't be just the mere possibility that a soil is reused. So sticking something in a stockpile and leaving it there for a couple of years is not acceptable under DAWCOP, and I don't think it should be really. But usually we tick that box by if there's a planning condition, or sorry, a planning consent on the site. And that demonstrates that there is certainty of use if that soil is part of a planning process. And importantly, the quantity is important. You can only use what you need to use on the site. You can't create, for example, a large environmental bund if that's not specified as part of the design of the works. So you can't be discarding or getting rid of material on a site. You have to use only what you need to use. And under the DARCOP, there are 3 different scenarios. So you can reuse materials on the site of origin. So within one development site, you can take material from one part of the site to the other, let's say a foundation excavation, and reuse it somewhere else on the site. And that can be made ground, or it can be natural soils on that site. You can transfer materials, soils between sites, which again is extremely helpful. But in that instance, you can only transfer clean, naturally occurring soil. Under the DARCOP, you can't transfer made ground between one site and another. To do that, formally, you would need an environmental permit or an exemption. And then there's a third scenario, which is a cluster project, or a hub and cluster, as it's sometimes called. That's where you have a hub site, a central site that accepts or takes in soils from a number of donor sites, and that can be made ground or natural soils. Then that material is processed, tested, sampled, make sure that it's suitable for use, and then it can be exported back to either the original sites or to receiving sites once it's confirmed that it's suitable. Again, unfortunately, the cluster projects is something the Environment Agency are scrutinising extremely rigorously at the moment, and there seems to be an issue with accepting cluster projects in many cases. So what's the process under DARCOP? It's very straightforward, which is, I suppose, one of its attractions. You produce a remediation strategy, or as you would normally, I suppose, on a site. Or if there isn't a remediation strategy and it's a simple project, then you can produce a design statement, which is a very simple statement to say that the material, what the composition of the material, and to say that it's suitable for use. The key document for the DARCOP is a materials management plan, and that outlines the parties involved, the nature of the development, the sources of the soils, where they're going to, how you're going to track that and record it, and all that information goes together into a single document, a verification report, which you produce at the very end of the project and submit to Claire. But before that, once you've produced the materials management plan, you then appoint a qualified person, and that's what I said I was earlier on, a QP. That person has to be completely independent of the project. They don't have to be independent of the company. They can be within the company, but they can't be involved in the project. And that person has a certain level of understanding, has gone through a test, an exam process with Claire to demonstrate that they understand the application of DARCOP. They review all the information. They submit the declaration to Claire, which is the organization that manages the process. And all of this can be done in a week or so. Bish, bash, bosh, as I said. Very straightforward, very, very easy. Moving on to reuse. There is another option where materials can be moved between sites. I've called this Tinder for surplus soils, and basically that's what it is. It's a matchmaking process where donor sites are connected to receiving sites, and those soils then don't necessarily become a waste, and they can be transferred between sites. But you need to be careful, because there are certain instances where they may become a waste, and an environmental permit is required. Certainly duty of care regulations would apply. And there are several different organizations that manage these registers of donor and receiving sites. Claire's is the largest one, their register of sites. But then the Soil Hub as well, which was launched quite recently. The Supply Chain Sustainability School has one as well. And there were a number in the past, NISP and WPE, which I'm not sure they operate anymore. Moving on to recycling, we're going down the waste hierarchy now. in terms of, well, sort of going back to reuse slightly, you can also, if you don't want to get an environmental permit, there is an option to get a waste exemption, an exemption from environmental permit. Those are very limited circumstances. One example is U1, which is the use of waste in construction is limited in terms of how much soil you can use, 1,000 tons or 5,000 tons of crush, say 6F2. It's limited in terms of how long you can store a material on site, and that exemption must be registered with DEFRA. In terms of recycling, we can use a mobile plant permit for treating soils or contaminated material on site and making them suitable for use. Cognition operate a mobile plant permit. That's a standard rules permit, and it's deployed on every. It's specifically deployed on every individual site. You go through a process of demonstrating that you have full control of any potential environmental impacts. And that permit is then valid for 12 months from the date you start the works. Worth noting that the deployment can take 8 weeks or even 12 weeks sometimes. So you need to plan and allow for that as part of your works program. Recycling, this is a really good example of recycling of construction arisings. It's now called the Environment Agency Quality Protocol. It was, some people may know it by its former name, the WRAP protocol. And this one, there are a number of them, but this one relates to aggregates from inert waste. The best example really is production of 6F2 or crush from demolition material, concrete crush or brick. And as I said there, it allows the processing of an inert granular material, only granular film. You need to produce or prepare a method of production, which is outlines strict compliance and verification requirements to demonstrate that the material is what it should be. And then once it's gone through that process and you've done all your verification and all your compliance, then that material is no longer a waste. It was originally, it's no longer a waste now. It's a commodity, it's a product, and it can be sold from the site. Another option for recycling is soil treatment facilities, and there's a whole network of these all across the country, all across the UK. And these are off-site soil treatment facilities. On these facilities, they're set up, they're sort of permanent facilities that are set up to treat soils if you don't have space on your own site to remediate. And they use all sorts of different technologies, bioremediation, soil washing. Bioremediation would be for hydrocarbon soil washing, for heavy metals, sorting and processing, cement stabilization or lime stabilization to lock in contaminants. The great benefit of this is that even though they're not cheap, they are competitive when compared to landfilling. And the reason for this is that you don't pay landfill tax when you send a material to a soil treatment facility. Later on, and I think in the next or few slides down, I'll explain why landfill tax is such an important factor. And this is the one that we're sort of really struggling with in the industry at the moment, and this is recovery. So this is where you're looking to replace a non-waste material, such as a virgin gravel from a quarry, with a waste material that performs the same function. Once the material is treated, the contaminated soils are treated, they're not waste when they're then incorporated in the final works. So you go through this process, produce a waste recovery plan, get your waste, your deposit for recovery environmental permit, and then once the works are completed, the recovered soils are recovered and they are no longer waste. However, the problem is that the process is extremely complicated, expensive, and takes forever, to be honest. At the moment, the average is a year and a half to 2 years, but I've known examples that have taken up to 5 years to get an environmental permit in place. And even after you've been in consultation for, in some instances, I know an example where the consultation lasted for 3 years, and they just couldn't get it over the line, couldn't agree. The details of the waste recovery plan and the environmental permit, and it was thrown out, and the development didn't go forward. I think that's it's pretty shocking, really, and not the way that we want to move forward in terms of sustainable development. And the last option, as I've said, sort of, because really at the moment because getting an environmental permit or a recovery permit is so difficult at the moment, we are having to dispose of more soil than we want to, if the program of a development requires it. No, I don't know of any project that can wait for 2 to 3 years to get an environmental permit in place. Landfill tax on landfills is currently £102 a tonne, which, as you can imagine, is racked up very quickly. There are several different categories of landfill: hazardous, non-hazardous, and inert. And it is important to know that I mentioned earlier on that you may unwittingly be carrying out a waste activity on your site if you don't have the correct process and paperwork in place. HMRC have become very focused on this because landfill tax is so high. It's a big revenue stream for HMRC, so they're going out looking for sites that have illegally or deposited waste and haven't regulated correctly. So those are the ways that you, going down through the waste hierarchy, that you can actually regulate waste. But as I said, and I've intimated a couple of times, there are some key challenges for us as an industry. And I think probably one of the bigger ones, which is not the fault of the Environment Agency, is that they're underfunded, hugely underfunded. And you can blame your government and DEFRA for that, and maybe think about that tomorrow when you're voting, if that's not too contentious. And in the Environment Agency, there is a huge backlog of environmental permit applications, which really is stymieing progress on this issue. Waste legislation and regulation, I don't think, is suited to construction sites. It's really set up for your typical domestic landfill or an industrial process. I think we need a different system for construction sites. As I said there, we're trying to shoehorn soil reuse into the environmental permit system, and it really isn't working at the moment. There seems to be a lack of pragmatism and understanding of the issues in some quarters of the Environment Agency and in the regulators, and a lack of clear guidance. And there are conflicting opinions. We've been waiting for, I think, 2 to 3 years now for version 3 of DACOP and some internal guidance from the Environment Agency, and it's just not forthcoming. So we're in the dark really at the moment. And I think recently, DACOP is being undermined. It's a hugely useful tool in the industry, and I think it's the best solution, best tool that we have. But there is resistance to using it in some quarters. Some would say that the system our DACOP has not been used properly in the past, or has been abused. That may be the case. Our industry isn't perfect, but I don't think you should throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't get rid of the system, just regulate it, police it properly, convict people, take people to task if they're not doing it properly. As I said, it's a massive issue for our industry. Many projects are delayed, and SILC, which is specialist in land condition organization, they did a survey recently and got a response that 20% of projects have been abandoned completely recently. And I know of 3 large residential developments with about 750 or so units that just haven't gone forward because they can't wait around for the permits, and the funding has been lost. We've been lobbying. That should be years of lobbying for SILC, AGS, ERC, and we don't seem to be getting anywhere at the moment. I'll skip past that because I'm running out of time a little bit, but I've got a few quick project examples that I'd like to show how this can work well if it's managed properly and if the correct processes are used. This is a site that we worked on for 6 odd years, a 50-acre former commercial, industrial site that was redeveloped for 3,500 homes. We negotiated and agreed a remediation strategy with the Environment Agency. And in the end, we agreed that it allowed us to excavate, treat, and reuse 1 million cubic meters of soil on the site from this formerly contaminated piece of land. 600,000 cubic meters were bioremediated or stabilized. And I think tellingly, the last figure there, less than 0.1% of soil was disposed of off-site. So basically, we reused everything on this site within the works. A similar project, this one was for Homes England on the Isle of Sheppy, a 32-acre site, former chemical works, a steel rolling mill. And again, this was remediation of made ground, a small area of landfill. It also had poor ground conditions, so we had to improve the ground as well using prefabricated vertical drains and surcharging. But all of this work was done under a mobile plant permit, but we also had a recovery permit. We did get an environmental recovery permit on this particular one for the processing and reusing of these materials. But we were fortunate because there was already an environmental permit in place on an adjacent site. So all we had to do was to change the boundary and add in a few more specific details about the work that we were doing on our site. But even that took us 8 months just to get that amendment to the environmental permit. In the end, we imported just over 50,000 cubic meters of soils for the surcharge and the cover system, and that was done under DAWCOP. And overall on these two sites, we processed and reused for almost 500,000 cubic meters of soil. But interestingly, there is surcharge on the site, but there's still a question over the reuse of that surcharge material. This is a clean, naturally occurring soil that was brought onto the site under DAWCOP. But there's a question now as to whether that is a waste and what happens to that material. Can it be reused on the site? Does the environmental permit have to be extended again to allow that to be reused, or can it be done under DAWCOP? We haven't got to the bottom of that one yet. I'll skip past that one because I am conscious of time. And then there's a last one, which is a gasworks in Kingston in London. This is one that we did a few years ago. We developed and agreed the remediation strategy with the Environment Agency and the local authority. This involved the demolition of the gas holder bases and the structures, but it was contaminated, as you might imagine. We used bioremediation, chemical oxidation, stabilization of soils. All of those basically threw everything at it to maximize the reuse of soil and minimize disposal. In the end, we treated 85,000 cubic meters and 0 soil went to landfill. Everything was reused within the works. However, we're working on another site more recently at Bethnal Green, and on that site, we're not allowed to do exactly the same process. Any contamination of soil, any contaminated soil that's above the agreed reuse criteria on that site have to be disposed of off-site. They can't be treated, they can't be reused within the works. Now, to me, I think that's well, this way it's madness. I think it's we really should be treating those soils and reusing them within the project. So where next? Last couple of slides. I think it's really important that we raise awareness, and that's why I'm talking today, putting my neck out a little bit, really. I've been quite, maybe a little bit controversial. We need to raise awareness, but also train people and understand how to use these processes properly. I think we need to lobby the Environment Agency, DEFRA, even the new Office for Environmental Protection, who are essentially the police for the Environment Agency. So we're looking to talk to them as well. I think we certainly need to maintain DAWCOP, but I also think there's an opportunity to expand it, to specifically allow for reuse of landfilled materials if they're suitable for use. I'm not talking about digging up domestic landfills. I'm talking about sites that are suitable for reuse with large quantities of recoverable soils and stockpile soils as well. That's an issue that crops up quite a bit. I'm no fan of Brexit, I can tell you, but is there a post-Brexit opportunity to redefine the classification of waste under UK legislation? Something that we're looking at. And really to understand, I suppose, from the Environment Agency, why there is this change of heart, I suppose, in requiring the use of environmental permits on construction site. What has changed? Maybe we could look at doing formulating a new, bespoke, simpler waste recovery permit that doesn't take 2 to 3 years to get in place. And being the eternal optimist, hope and pray for logic and pragmatism to prevail, both in the regulators, but also in the industry as well ourselves. I have a very quick video just to play. Hopefully this will work. Yeah, so these are just some examples of how we carry out reuse, processing, recycling of soils on various sites, using lots of different technologies, remediation technologies, just some simple technologies as well, such as crushing demolition erosions to produce 6F2. That last one was an excavation of a launch chamber for a TBM in Silvertown, where we reused all the excavation in the enabling works. We processed and treated and reused the materials on site under mobile plant permit and under DACOP. This one is the site in SHEPPY that I was telling you about. You can see this processing of materials, but then also that white geotextile there, the material that's on top, that is the cover system to protect future uses of the site. All of that material was brought in under DACOP and used from other sites. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, lots of things to think about. I'm more than happy to take questions. I haven't seen the questions come through. I'm happy to answer any of those, but also you have my details there. If people want to get in touch with me to talk about this, then I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andy. It's always great to see the different examples when you're talking about these challenges and the different methods. We do have a couple of questions. Before we get started, I'll ask one. Just why do you think there was a resistance to use the DACOP?
I really don't understand, because I think it is such since 2008, it has been such a really beneficial tool to our industry. I think maybe people in the regulators have looked at it again. Maybe the legal people have looked at it again and decided that there are certain instances where it doesn't exactly fit with the waste legislation. And I do understand that there's this sort of conflict between some people in the agency who really want to see it succeed and move forward, and others who say that you absolutely have to comply with legislation. I agree, we have to comply with the legislation, but if the legislation is wrong, clearly it's wrong in some instances, then we need to do something to get over this impasse. It's succeeded before. It's like one of the slides that I skipped past there quickly was the Environment Agency have now said that any landfill waste definitely cannot come under DACOP. But when DACOP was launched originally, there were case studies on the CLARE website showing exactly that: reuse, regeneration, processing of landfill soils and reusing them within a site, all under DACOP. That's no longer allowed at the moment.
Perfect, thank you. We've got a couple of questions on MMP, so I'll just kind of ask those. So Matthew's saying, hi Andy, thanks very much for an interesting presentation. What are your thoughts on the need to use an MMP under DACOP for a construction scheme that is on a greenfield site only? The reason for the MMP is to demonstrate that the material is not a waste and is therefore not subject to waste legislation. However, waste legislation states that the uncontaminated soil and the naturally occurring material excavated in the course of construction activities, where it is certain that the material will be used for the purposes of construction in its natural state on which it was excavated, is included. So yeah, I think the question there was, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I understand the question. I think, I suppose this goes back to my point earlier on that a soil doesn't have to be contaminated to be a waste. they're two completely different sets of legislation. So waste legislation and contaminated land legislation are not the same. So even if a topsoil is excavated, or a natural gravel or London clay or something like that, that absolutely can become a waste if it's not managed properly. So I would say that if material is reused on a site, and natural material is reused on a site, then you don't necessarily have to use, and there is a position statement that says that you're exempt from waste legislation if you reuse natural soils on site. But I would suggest that an MMP is the best way to make sure that you're covered, that you have demonstrated to yourself and to the Environment Agency that your operation is not a waste operation, even though the material isn't contaminated. And an MMP is not expensive. The administration fee is £165 for up to 5,000 cube, I think, and then it increases for values after that. But and producing an MMP is not an expensive business, especially on a large construction site. So I think it's probably useful to have as a process to make sure belt and braces that what you're doing is not a waste activity.
And what changes would you like to see the MM process in the forthcoming guidance?
I'd like it to be categorical in saying what is allowed. I'd like it to include landfilled soils. I don't see why that shouldn't be. That should be an excluded activity. It was in there before. What's changed? Why was that? Why is that being excluded now? Also, as I mentioned earlier, stockpile soils. That is a difficult one because that has shown that people haven't planned. Properly planned for the reuse of a material and have stockpiled the soil on the site. You could argue that if there wasn't an exemption in place and that's been there for more than 12 months, that is a waste. And I understand that, but if we can't get an environmental permit for the reuse of that material, then what options do we have? If we can't wait for 2 to 3 years to get an environmental permit in place, if we can't use DALCOP, then there's no option but to send that material to landfill, and that is a disgrace in my mind. We need to find a way through, and I think DALCOP is probably the best way forward.
Kerry is asking, what proportion of soil wasted from construction site is defined as contaminated?
Oh, that's a difficult one. The definition of contamination, there is no hard and fast definition of what a contaminated soil is, because it all depends on the pollutant linkage. So you're going back to your source pathway receptor scenario. If a soil can be contaminated if it's used in one particular situation and not contaminated if it's used in another situation. So for example, if something has sort of moderate contamination, you wouldn't use it in a domestic garden, but you may absolutely be able to use it underneath a building or a road, or as a fill beneath a cover layer. So there's no hard and fast rule as to say what's contaminated or not, and therefore I can't really give you a proportion in terms of construction arisings. But on our typical sites, the vast majority of material doesn't need remediation. Usually, on a typical site, we look to excavate out hotspots of contamination, take out the sources, treat those, deal with those separately, and then the vast majority of the residual soils, even though they're made ground, are suitable for use within the works.
Fantastic, thanks. Just to note that we do have quite a few questions, so we'll just answer a couple, but Andy has put his contact details on there, so if you want to get in touch, they are on there. I'll just ask this one here from Rebecca. What would be your ideal vision for the way forward for soils reused to be specified, and requiring an environmental permit to send material to landfill seems a better way around, assuming appropriate risk assessment and reuse procedures are in place?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but yes, so long as risk assessment has been in place and the soil has been correctly assessed and is suitable for use, then why not be allowed to use it under DALCOP on a site? Environmental permitting for construction soil is just not working at the moment. You can ask anybody in our industry who's involved in this and they will say the same thing. I don't think environmental permitting is the way forward. I did put in an option there of a simpler environmental permit, if we could have some assurance that that could be dealt with quickly, promptly, within sort of land development timescales, then that might be a way forward. Demonstrating that a soil, when it's treated and it's reused on the site, is recovered and is no longer a waste. I think that would be an option, but why not include that within as an option within the DAOCOP? I suppose you could have it as a sort of a two-pronged approach for different situations. I'm just sort of thinking on the fly here, but yeah, I think I've made it clear that my preference is for DAOCOP to be retained and actually expanded rather than being limited, as it seems to be the way we're going.
We have two questions that we'll finish on just around QP. So somebody's asking, is it still worth considering being trained as a QP now? And the other question is, many would suggest that a QP who works for a company undertaking a project is not truly independent, or there's always a more direct financial incentive. Do you think having a standard fee and requirement to be independent from the project company would give more confidence in the regulation of these sites?
So the first one, yes, absolutely. I think we need more QPs. I think it's an excellent system. The training course is really interesting and really good. I know the people who do the trainers, who are trainers at Clare, they're very knowledgeable in their trade. And even if you don't QP lots of MMPs in a year, I think still as an exercise to allow you to understand waste legislation, waste regulation, and the DAOCOP process, absolutely, I think that I would suggest that you go through that. The other one, whether a QP should be independent from the company and not just the project. If it did, I don't think it's necessary personally, because I've QP'd lots of, I actually don't QP for projects at Cognition, because we have somebody that does it for us, because invariably I'm, as the technical director there, I'm involved in the project, so I can't QP them as an independent. But in my previous work, in a large consultancy, I did lots of QPing for projects that I had absolutely no involvement in at all. I had no financial incentive, or there was no benefit in me taking a slanted view, I suppose, in terms of my review of the MMP. However, if it did give the Environment Agency or the regulators additional confidence that the DAOCOP process was being followed strictly, then absolutely. If that was included as a requirement that it was outside of the company, then yes, definitely. But only if there's a benefit to doing that. And a standard fee, yes, that could be done as well, but you just need to be a bit careful. Some projects are more complicated than others. A two-house development, being the QP on a two-house development, is a much simpler and easier process than a 3,500 unit development. So there possibly may need to be a scale of fees there.
Fantastic, thank you. Like I say, I am aware that there's a few more questions that we haven't had time for. So Andy's contact details are there if you would like to contact Andy directly. That's it from us today. Thank you for logging on. I hope you found it beneficial and informative.